Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring.
I wanted to take a moment before we start to let you know about the Nurole board community, Nurole's new level of paid membership. I'm often asked by people how to get their first board role and build a portfolio career. And that's why we started the community, which catalyzes your board career by giving you access to smart online networking, one-to-one career guidance with our headhunters, peer discussion threads, third-party board roles, a find a mentor service, and Q&As with senior board members. We're running a limited offer of a 2-month free community trial for Enter the Boardroom listeners. Head to community.nurole.com and apply the code NBC2month. That's November Bravo Charlie, numeric 2, Mike Oscar November Tango Hotel.
Today's guest, Dr. Dambisa Moyo, is a co-principal of Versaca Investments, a family office focused on growth investing globally. She serves on a number of global corporate boards, including Chevron, Conde Nast, as well as the Oxford University Endowment Investment Committee. Past boards include 3M, Barclays Bank, Barrick Gold, SAB Miller, Seagate Technology, and the UK Department for International Trade. She holds a doctorate in economics from Oxford, a master's from Harvard, and is recognized for fresh and innovative ideas as the author of 4 New York Times best-selling books. Her newest book, How Boards Work, was ranked number 5 on the Wall Street Journal Best Business Books list. Dr. Moyo, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. Thank you for including me.
I really enjoyed reading your book. One of the things that jumped out at me at the beginning was you wrote about your experiences of the most extreme and testing situations in the corporate world, including the death of a chairman, CEO succession, in both hiring and firing, M&A situations, regulatory fines, activist shareholders, insider shareholders on the board, expropriation of assets by governments. Which of those was the most challenging and why?
Well, I very fortuitously have not encountered a bankruptcy. But when I look at that list, really in a 15-year board career, it's pretty harrowing. Death of a CEO, etc. But to my mind, really, rather than pick one thing, which I'll give some examples in a moment, I think really the theme that dominates challenge in a boardroom is surprises. It's surprises because the financials that you might have put together in terms of how you expect revenue to increase or expenses to be managed or even reduced, all that is up for grabs in a crisis environment. How you operate, the processes of an organization are tested when you have a surprise. And also just the culture of an organization, how an organization operates, how people link into each other also is put under pressure when you have a surprise. Obviously, we can count on, you've just gone through a number of what I would call largely endogenous surprises. So these were things that were quite specific and particular to the boards that I was on, death of the CEO, etc. But there are real examples of exogenous surprises, like the pandemic. If you look back to 2020, in January, I was attending Davos, the World Economic Forum. There were lots of rumors in January about the likelihood of a pandemic, but it was very hard at that time to calibrate what that might mean. And if you think about it, just a week or two after that, I had board meetings in which we were endorsing the plans, the forecasts for 2020 that January. And of course, by mid-March, the world had completely changed. And in all those aspects that I've already highlighted, from the financials were being challenged, how are we going to generate revenue, how are we going to keep costs managed, to operations, are our employees healthy, can we operate from people being at home, and all the other aspects around and questions around culture all emerged and became incredibly challenging. I just picked the pandemic, but there are many other examples of exogenous things that can happen. Geopolitics is another one. One day you have 20% of your revenue coming from Russia. The next day, quite unexpectedly, you have to pull out your resources and shut down the operation. There are many of these types of examples, so both exogenous and endogenous, but ultimately it's about the element of surprise and how it challenges the financials, the strategy, the operations, and the culture of an organization.
I've heard some people challenge boards saying there should be no surprises. As a board, you should have, if you've got the right mix of people around the table, you should be able to anticipate everything. Now, I've never bought into that as an idea. And I think one of my favorite, I think it was in Super Forecasting, where they included a excerpt from one of the intelligence agencies basically predicting the next 10 years over the course of a century and showing how they were almost diametrically wrong every time with their predictions. And I think it goes back to that. I think Terry Smith has said there are two sorts of investors: those who know they can't predict the future and those who can't predict the future. How do you think about navigating that uncertainty as a board member?
So there are two elements to your question, is what I would call uncertainty, and then there's risk. And this is the Knightian uncertainty kind of philosophy, which is that if it's risk, it can be managed. We can debate back and forth about not only calibrating the cost of the risk, but also thinking about the timing of the risk. People who say, oh, we can actually to the nth degree predict risk, I don't buy that. I think you could say, well, pandemics seem to come every 100 years. Maybe we're due for a new pandemic, but even then it would be very hard to thread the needle on when exactly would occur. But more than that, how the system, not just financial operations and strategy, but also the culture of an organization could adapt. Before the pandemic hit in earnest in March 2020, I had no visibility around Zoom or work from home. And I tend to sit on audit and risk committees for all the boards that I've been on in the past 15 years. And we didn't have a scenario where people would be at home and there'd be a pandemic, which for the first 8 to 9 months, there was no resolution. There wasn't a vaccine or there wasn't a path forward. During that period, I wrote an article for Harvard Business Review talking about how boards should respond and what they should be thinking about. It was titled 10 Things Boards Should Focus On During a Pandemic. And it was really about the tactics, focusing on things that were sort of emergent and an emergency. Where are our people? Are they safe? Are they infected? Are they not? What about our supply chains? Those are things that were in the immediacy, really in your face. And then there were longer term issues that were materially changed by the advent of the pandemic. Things like, what is our strategy now? Are some competitors that may not have managed their financial systems in a disciplined way may have become vulnerable in terms of takeover targets? So there are a lot of things that emerge both in the tactics, short-term response, as well as the longer-term strategic response. And as I said earlier, you can really think about having systems that could forecast all of those things. We had no idea when it would hit. We had no idea what the response would have been. Was it going to be global? Most big boards that I've been privileged to sit on have global operations, different countries, different approaches. Indeed, just being in the United States, the states had different approaches. Some of the more red states didn't have the lockdown quarantines. The more blue states like California were very strict. So these are things there was no way to anticipate those things. But then most importantly, it's also very hard to anticipate the response of the culture and of the organization. You want to defend the culture, but was it the case that a lot of that culture was linked to being in rooms together, seeing our colleagues? And how do you defend that culture when people are much more disparate? So I'm a little bit skeptical about people who think that they can do it, risk management to the nth degree. What I will say, and this is a counsel I've received from a very wise 87-year-old board colleague of mine, who said, listen, we're always going to be surprised. And I think that's a very good frame. And that's where I started the conversation today. And if you're, as a board member, as a CEO, as a management team, think about life that we're always going to be surprised, then sure, you do have to risk mitigate for those types of scenarios. And you have to then decide based on judgment and your own experiences, what calibration, what probability you ascribe to certain scenarios happening. But I think ultimately his counsel, that doesn't mean hide under your bed. It means be prepared for these scenarios that could emerge. And when they emerge, make sure that your financials, your operations, your processes, your culture are able to stand up for whatever that surprise may be.
Can you give me an example in practice of what that means?
In fact, it's interesting because serving on audit committees and risk committees, that is really the mandate. And traditionally, certainly in financial institutions, risk and audit used to be one committee. And the whole point was that risk would look to the future and say, okay, what are our risks? We have risks that the macroeconomy is going to slow down. And interest rates will be higher. If interest rates are higher, where are we making our money? Probably not from lending because it's too expensive for borrowers, retail or institutional, to borrow, but we might make our money from some other investment opportunities. So you start to work through what those forecasts might look like. And in the event that, as we saw in 2008, 2009, that things become incredibly challenged, you have a plan to mitigate and to basically manage through employee numbers, employee roles, thinking about what your cost income ratios look like, how much money should you be generating in those types of scenarios. Again, that's more on the financial side. And then we have literally developed out plans, thinking about where our people are deployed. In many instances, just to be clear, these, especially in the financial industry, these are mandated. So the regulator will say, I need you to have a backup plan so that if there were to be a cyber breach, we know that if there is a breach, the top 5 employees are going to meet at this X location, and we're going to get off of a broad-based internet system, and we'll use a much more siloed system. So these plans are actually in place, whether it was a financial crisis or a pandemic. There were rollout plans, and I think the thing about the surprise is that there might be elements of that surprise that mean that your plans may not be as versatile as you might want them to be. But we've had so many examples of this. We've had the LIBOR issues when I was on the Barclays Bank board. We've talked about the pandemic, and I've given you some examples on geopolitics where you're managing a team of people who work in Russia, and all of a sudden they can't, or even let's take a more recent one, Israel, where you have operations and people can't get to work. They're living in very different conditions. How do we play a role as an organization, not just in terms of providing support in Gaza and Israel to our employees in terms of humanitarian aid or counseling, but also for people who want to leave, what is our role there? So there's a lot of detailed planning, and then that's really focused on the risk side. Very quickly on the audit side, if risk is looking forward, audit tends to look back. You look at what worked, what didn't work, lessons learned. Again, heavily regulated in the US with the SEC, the Companies House in the UK. You do have a lot of guidance on how to deal with cyber attacks, and we use a lot of what the regulatory environment provides us, but also dealing with peers and colleagues in different organizations, different sectors, but also different organizations in the same sector to try and get a better sense of how to deal with challenges.
We have this online community where board members can come and do these mastermind groups and exchange the challenges that they're facing with each other. And interestingly, we had a discussion recently around the risk committee, and the person facing this challenge said it is the most painful of all the committees. It has the longest papers that I get anyway. I don't get compensated for it. Like, am I mad to be doing it? How do you think about the risk committee?
I love the risk committee, I must say, but it's kind of, I think I can see why it's in people's nature. I remember something, Professor Rudiger Dornbusch, who was an MIT professor when I was studying at Harvard many, many years ago. And he said the thing about crises is that they always show up later than you anticipate, and they always show up much bigger than you could anticipate. And I think one of the challenges in being in the risk committee is that it's very hard to talk about risks that people aren't already aware of. So if I said to you, what are the risks of the British economy, or what are the risks of company X? We'd all have the same list. It'd say, oh, it's growth slowing, cost of living, political uncertainty from geopolitics, but political uncertainty also from local politics. We would have the same list. But the thing is, it's not the things that we know that hurts us in a way. It's the things that we don't know, that we haven't properly calibrated for. And it's the scale of a problem. I can tell you, oh, there is likely to be another pandemic. Sure. How big is it going to be? Is it going to be like SARS or bird flu, or is it going to be like COVID-19? Couldn't tell you. And then also, I couldn't tell you when it's going to happen. So this is where I think people can see the risk committee as being navel gazing in some respect. But I actually really enjoy it.
Fantastic. You have obviously been through an amazing range of experiences there, and you were obviously very experienced when you started on that journey. But what is one thing that you know now that you didn't before that you would share with others at the start of their journey?
I think the most important thing is to be open minded. And I know that sounds almost like motherhood and apple pie, but I think too often people come into a boardroom, into most situations, but particularly come into a boardroom with very detrimental consequences of being quite ideological about how the world works, what's important, how a company should evolve. And I think there's not enough listening that occurs about the differences in different regions. There are numerous examples of this and that we've seen. I'm thinking something that popped into my mind is a number of companies who are Western companies that were operating in places like India or elsewhere, which have very different cultural norms, felt, well, we're a big company, we're important, we're going to go in there and we're going to change the cultural landscape. Hard to do, and probably not listening enough, doing too much dominating. But there are numerous examples of that in geopolitical space, thinking about how do you operate as a country, or excuse me, as a company that is in a country that is democratic and market capitalist, but you want to open up offices in a place like China, which is state capitalist and has deprioritized democracy. How are you actually going to run operations in that environment? I think too often people go to these situations thinking we're going to change them or we're going to exert our view. And so ultimately, my fundamental point is too much ideology in the boardroom is incredibly dangerous. And I think that the worst performers in a boardroom are far too ideological and not open-minded enough.
I love that. I was just listening to a podcast around how to ask better questions. One of my key takeaways from it was the key is having curiosity at the root of your question, because too many questions have an implicit criticism or the quagestion. That's a suggestion embedded in the question. And it feels that very much resonates with what you're saying there. I want to move on to talk about the role of the board. In how boards work, I thought you did an amazing job of boiling down the essence of the role of the board down to these sort of three core areas: shaping company strategy, selecting leaders, in particular the CEO, and safeguarding the company's culture, ethics, and values. In your experience, how aligned are board members in the way they think about the role of the board?
A couple of thoughts come to mind in terms of your question. I think, first of all, I didn't necessarily whip up these ideas myself. In the license to trade permits that corporations or companies get from Company House or from Delaware LLC listings, as it's commonly done in the US corporations, there is a de jure explanation for what the roles and responsibilities of board members are. And it's from that where I really derive these 3 points. The second point that I would stress is that some aspects of strategy, CEO succession, and ethics is quite static in nature. People will say, well, boards, what do they really do? They're only useful when there's an emergency or there's a crisis. And actually, if you look back in history to the 17th century, 18th century, when the first boards were established, it's true that they've always tended to focus on strategy and succession planning as the first two really key pillars of the board role. I would say the cultural thing was, I don't want to say after facts, but it wasn't really something that was explicitly embedded in the remit of the board. And that has changed. We saw that with some of the new rules and regulations that have come out in the last several years on ESG in particular, but more generally about board members thinking more about stakeholders and widening or expanding the utility function to not just focus on financial stakeholders or financial shareholders, but think about stakeholders more broadly, employees, community, etc. And so in that sense, there's been some innovation in the board role, not just on strategy and succession, but now we've added in this values piece. And it's less so about the North Star that every board member says, yeah, totally get it. We're here to do succession. We're here to do strategy, here to do culture. It's more about how you execute. How do you actually get the best CEOs? Is it a peacetime scenario? Is it a wartime scenario? How are you picking your CEO? How do you think about the strategy of the company? Is it about allocating the marginal resources, investing in R&D in the company, or is it expanding a footprint into a different region? Those types of questions really continue to challenge the legalese that says we're about succession strategy and culture. We're in a different world now. How do we do culture in a world that's much more heterogeneous and culture has changed so much? How do we think about strategy in a deglobalizing versus a globalizing world? I mean, these are all aspects of change of the board mandate, although at its roots, it stayed the same.
What have you learned about the value that you can add as a board member in each of those areas that might not be intuitive to a highly experienced executive?
I like this question a lot because I call myself a non-conventional board member, meaning when I joined my first corporate board, I had not had a senior position as an operator. I had not been the CEO of a company or CFO of a company. And if I look around today, I think the rule of thumb is that the best boards have probably around 40%, 40 to 50% of their board members are operational people who have clear operational experience in finance, as CFO or CEO, or etc., coming onto a board. But that has changed. When I joined my first board in 2009, I had no experience in the operational side, and I was very much unconventional, very rare to have someone with my background at that time. But it's changed because the world has become more complicated. The things that I have focused my life's work on geopolitics, on investment, thinking about exogenous threats and challenges that public policy has to navigate, AI, climate, etc., are things that an operational person would be aware of, but perhaps is not as deeply involved in terms of their network, in terms of how they think about framing that as someone like myself. And so, in that respect, I think there is still a core set of board members whose expertise is very warranted and very important coming from an operational background. But more and more, I think it's clear that people like myself who come from non-conventional backgrounds but have an important perspective to bring to the boardroom are seeing and finding a way to add value to these organizations in a very complex and challenged world.
For someone who comes from that non conventional background, how do you think they can best position themselves for these board roles?
I think there's no substitute for hard work. I mean, I've written 5 books in the area. I definitely have leaned in to try and make it clear, if not by maybe I wasn't speaking the words, but definitely showing that this is an area of expertise that I believe I have. But as a practical matter, I think too often people say, "Oh, I want to be on a board." But they haven't really asked a fundamental question, which is who in the executive management team is going to call you? Because I think that is a very good hurdle. It's a very good lens to think about your value to an organization. So if you come from a marketing background, for example, I would be expecting that the chief marketing officer should call you occasionally and say, "Hey, listen, I'm looking at this campaign, or have you ever seen this type of thing done? What do you think about new distribution channels on social media?" Or whatever the question might be, but they should see value in reaching out to you, whatever your expertise is. As I mentioned, I happened to end up on a number of boards that had massive geopolitical risk, particularly coming from the emerging markets. And to this day, get phone calls from the CEOs, but also from teams who are doing risk management, as well as thinking about investment and planning for the organization. They're the ones who tend to call me. Sometimes the CFO, because I'm on the audit committee, they're the ones who tend to call me. So that is the guiding or North Star question. Before you say, "I want to be on a board," maybe ask yourself, who from the management team is going to call me? If you're a technology expert, you want the CTO of the company to call you, or the person who's in charge of cyber risk. If they're not calling you, or if you're not seeing what's important to that person from reading the annual reports, then you probably are not going to be adding as much value as you might think. And look, I'm the first person to put my hand up and say I've been in many ways quite a generic jack of many trades, so to speak. And I think it is a higher burden on the individual to say, "Hey, I know I've done X, Y, and Z, but really this is what I'm bringing to the table as a perspective on emerging markets." I've been fortunate enough, for example, to travel over 80 countries developing, rich, poor, democratic, non-democratic. And so being able to say, hey, I've worked in these places, we're looking at this lens of value in one way, but if you're sitting in an authoritarian state, they might be looking at it in a different way. Those are the kind of kernels of value that somebody in an operational position may not have, and where you can really market yourself as having unique expertise that could be value add.
I love that. That feels like a brilliant North Star question, not actually just for candidates, for boards as well. Who on the executive is going to call this prospective board member? You put forward 3 areas where boards need to be better that related to those core 3 areas: renewing their approach to strategy, upgrading their succession planning, and introducing an ethics committee. I'm keen to explore those ideas further, and maybe we can start with strategy. You advocated having an ethics committee focused on safeguarding the company's culture and values. Should there not be a strategy committee, given its importance for the board's role?
The reason strategy committees are not devolved into a committee of the board is because the board in its entirety jointly is responsible for strategy. That is one of the rules of the boardroom. And so, therefore, it actually behooves the institution to have a board that understands that strategic, especially in a time when CEOs and management teams can get very easily seduced into the short term, quarterly reporting, etc. You want to make sure that there is a place where that is representing stakeholders, financial shareholders, and other stakeholders that is looking beyond just a quarter here, a quarter, 2 quarters ahead. And to me, that is a responsibility of the board. And I think it's also really important that the board is able to bring all its talents into the debate around the strategic path of the organization. So I'm not a great big supporter of subcommittees in general. I've been convinced of their relevance in certain situations, but I think something like strategy must remain at a board level, complete and full board level point. And I think that that's the best way to do it.
There was a recent discussion in one of the mastermind groups that I mentioned earlier where they were talking about audit committees and how actually often, well, obviously it is in a committee and it's delegated, but at the same time, all board members have responsibility and increasing responsibility for that. And yet, if they're not on the committee, it's an uncomfortable balance to strike. And I guess the reason why people have committees is they can be more effective. It's that 2 pizza teams or smaller teams get more done at the cost of less cognitive diversity. So why do you think the audit committee why does that need a dedicated committee, or perhaps you don't?
When you've been in, had a long tenure as I have in these boardrooms, you've heard everything should be at the board level. No, everything should be devolved. So I get both arguments. I think fundamentally, the responsibilities of the audit committee, as I mentioned to you a moment ago, are backward looking. And a lot of the audit committee responsibilities are governed by regulatory oversight of government agencies like the Security Exchange Commission, like the FSA or FCA in the UK. And that means there's a particular type of expertise that tends to populate the audit committee. People who are financially literate, and by that I mean they tend to have audit experience or accounting experience. They understand the nuance of debits and credits, etc., tends to populate that committee. So a very particular type of expertise. If you're going to do SOX reporting or Sarbanes-Oxley reporting or thinking about GAAP accounting, these are very technical accounting and audit financial terms that it really should be devolved to people who've got that expertise, which is why it tends to be devolved into a specific committee. The vulnerability of the board writ large to things that happen in a devolved committee then come up for signature is true. And I'll give myself an example. I don't have a tech background, and yet technology, whether you're thinking about generative AI or you're thinking about just ways in which you want to enhance the operations of an organization, or the risks that emerge from cyber, are absolutely critical to the survival and success of a business. However, having somebody who's got a tech background reporting, even a tech board member reporting to the board, I have to rely on their good judgment and their knowledge. And sure, I can do as much research or training to get up to speed in lingo, but there's nothing that beats experience. And so there is a lot of work that has to be devolved. Some of the stuff that gets devolved is much more instinct based. And I'm not at all being disparaging, but nominations and governance, I think, are things where you don't necessarily need somebody who has spent a lifetime studying nominations and governance. Nice to have, but it's not critical. Whereas something like audit is very technical, and the devolved nature of that committee, I think, is very justified.
I was discussing your dual track proposed approach to strategy, which I thought was really intriguing, with a board member who instantly scrunched up their face with skepticism. Can you just explain what exactly you mean by that process, dual track process? And also, have you seen it working in practice?
Ultimately, in a very competitive world, for market share, for capital, for talent, the best thing any organization can do, and by that I mean a government, a school, a university, a company, is to try and get the best talent to contribute to the organization's continued operations. And having a dual track, which essentially, for our purposes, I'll summarize as not just having the board essentially rubber stamp a fully baked strategic plan by the management team, but instead have the board have a competitive is not the right word, but an alternative go at what are the important aspects of strategic change that the business should be thinking about. Where should we be operating? Which regions? How would we think about geopolitical risk? How do we think about technology? How do we think about climate? And then having this meeting of the board, which has a lot of talent, with the management team to debate what this is, what the strategic plan might be, I think is net value positive. And so that was really the point I was making, because I think we could, in principle, lose a lot of talented perspectives if we just say, well, it's just the board, we'll just show up with a fully baked report and just need them to rubber stamp it. Well, then you're missing out on the perspectives and experiences of some very talented, smart, operators and thinkers. And that was really what I was getting at. Like, how do we further draw out without the board being tainted by what the management thinks already? How do we further draw out some of the talent and expertise and experiences of those board members? Have I seen this in play? Yes, I have. Of course, it would be in the United States because they love innovation. They're always tinkering with it in the US. It's clearly not slam dunk, but we see much more red teams, green teams at the board level before they have this strategic session with the full board and executive. It's also been discussed with proxy agencies like ISS and Glass Lewis, and there are others that have talked about what more can the board be doing to make sure that we're tapping into that talent.
I had a discussion with another podcast guest, Roger Martin, where he was advocating a setup was cutting through both the exec and non-exec. So effectively he had one team focused on coming up with one strategy, but it included a combination of execs and non-execs, another on another and another on another, and then they would go up against each other.
Fundamentally, it's about innovation. So I don't a priori say my way is the only way. I think it's great to debate what the pros and cons of these different approaches are. But I wouldn't just squirm my face and say it hasn't worked. And that's not a good enough reason. Just because it hasn't worked doesn't mean it might not work, or at least some of the things that are being challenged, the status quo that's being challenged by having these ideas, I think is something we should be debating. I think boards themselves should be debating. And we're constantly debating tenure, we're debating populating boards. What kind of people do we want? Why not better milk out the value of these boards when they're there? There's so many talented people, and more, the age is getting younger. So if your job is just seen as rubber stamping, and I joined my first board when I was 38, why do I want to have a lifetime sitting on a board where it's just rubber stamping? I prefer to get tapped to add more value, offer more of a perspective. What are your experiences? You were in Davos. What were people saying about the pandemic? You're at a conference with Sam Altman talking about generative AI. Bring that to the strategic discussion. I think that there should be avenues for that in the boardroom.
Let's talk about succession. In terms of CEO selection, you reference your experience on one board of 4 CEOs in a 6-year period. What did you learn?
I think people listening to my bio, it'll be very obvious. So I don't think I'm breaching any confidence. This is a public thing. So it was Barclays Bank. And I would say the biggest learnings is that a board has to take in a lot of exogenous and external input into who they're picking as a CEO. You know, you ask regulators, you ask government officials, you want to get a sense of the man, as we used to say. I'm sure that's not even allowed to say anymore, but I'm of a different generation. I've got fantastic friends who are CEOs, such as Emma Walmsley, Dame Emma at GSK, but many others. And you want to get as broad a sense of this person in times of challenge, in times of culture building. How do they engage? And I think really being able to tap into a broad array of sources, back channeling is great on paper, but it can be quite dangerous if those same organizations or people feel that they have a greater say in who a CEO might be. So, to put it simply, you could be in the danger of putting a certain type of person into a seat simply because the regulator, who of course does govern license to trade for the business, you know, you want to make sure that you're all on side. But if their motivations for having a certain type of person or certain person in the situation as CEO dominates your choice and is against what the board might think or people on the board might think is the best candidate, it's those type of exogenous or external input, whether it's, I just said regulators, but it could be shareholders. Those types of input, while welcome, I think should not dominate the ultimate decision. And I think that is a big learning. Ultimately, you're the board. You should have the final judgment. You should have the final perspective, and you should not be ramroded by shareholders or vocal minorities. And I don't mean literally minorities, but smaller groups, subgroups in either employees or shareholders or NGOs or regulators.
Let's talk lastly about ethics. One of your suggestions was for a committee, despite your concerns around committees in general. You're advocating that boards should have an ethics committee. How should those ethics committees be guided? One of our past podcast guests, Professor Andrew Kakabadze, argued the reason that boards have got into trouble is because they've sometimes tried to make ethical decisions and that there is no absolute right answer. And so it brings in this complexity. What's your approach to that?
I think anything where the board is now taking on moral decisions and pining on what is right or wrong. And I'm not saying we don't have values, that is absolutely warranted, but it can go too far if we start deciding that there's a moral stance that the company should be taking that's beyond this cultural values. I agree with that. But notwithstanding that, let me just start by saying the reason I was proposing a ethics committee is that we are emerging, continue to emerge, I should say, from a period where many CEOs, I believe in the book, I talk about hundreds of CEOs and CFOs and even board members were removed from positions for ethical violations. This is whether it's Me Too, unfairness, whatever, take your pick. Sometimes illegal behavior, but illegal behavior is almost easier to police. If somebody does something that's illegal, you just fire them, no problem. But things that are shades of gray or where there's not really good transparency from the board, I think those are the ethical questions that I was referring to. And we've had hundreds of people lose their jobs for that. And when we interview for CEO candidates, traditionally we have probed and pushed them on their financial expertise. We've asked for examples of team management. We've asked them, how did you grow revenue? How did you reduce costs? How did you build teams? How did you get promoted? Think about pay and promotion. We've asked them all these questions about financial aspects, the operational aspects, processes of running a company. We've even asked them strategic questions. How do you think about investing in China versus India, given the sizes of these populations? Those types of questions. But we never asked ethical questions, which seems completely upside down. If ethical questions are the reason a large proportion, hundreds of people CEOs and CFOs are losing their jobs, then we need to do much more to investigate and evaluate the ethical stance of those without, again, judgment. I'm not saying if I am a conservative, more Republican type of board member, I will never hire somebody who's more democratic and liberal. I am not saying that at all. I mean, that should definitely be out of the boardroom. What I am saying is these ethical questions of how to manage teams of diversity, think about transparent measures to manage the process of fairness and transparency on compensation, on promotion. Those types of ethical questions need to be managed much more aggressively. We manage financial reporting with the CFO. We manage strategic and operations with the different business managers of these different units. Where is the ethics being policed or managed? And by the way, it's not again static. We need some portal that allows us to continue to evaluate, but get better at this ethical muscle. And traditionally, it hasn't been a natural place to evaluate ethics in newcomers, a CEO coming in or succession planning, but it also hasn't been traditionally a way of even evaluating board members, the ethics of board members.
Dr. Moyo, the time has flown by, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Sure.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most.
When one board member repeats something another board member has said, and they make it out like to be like it's new. Many women, I'm sure, wherever they are, will be nodding their heads because it does tend to be a gender thing.
Favorite quote?
A quote of one of my best friends, who's the chair of Starbucks, Melody Hobson, is "The numbers don't lie." So I am a numbers girl through and through.
Most significant professional insight?
Not everybody is trying to get you. I worry a lot about the younger generations. Everybody's so skeptical and so cynical. Somebody's trying to take me down. Some of the most successful, most incredible opportunities that I've had in my career have come from people who don't look like me. Men, white, different countries, different backgrounds. And I think remaining open-minded to those good things that can happen, just, erring on the side of not naivete, but being constructively positive. It's been a game changer for my life and my career.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I came into the boardroom probably thinking people with operational experience could be less than 40% of a board. I'm now more inclined to say that they do need to have a bigger proportion of the boardroom.
What are you invested in and why?
Definitely in the future, which means technology and energy transition. Definitely. I love investing in things that are fundamentally going to change, not just consumerism, but also public goods, education, healthcare, how we interact, all these types of things.
And lastly, 3 things our listeners should take away if they take away nothing else from this podcast.
First, that there are opportunities abound for people who have unconventional backgrounds in the boardroom. So brush up your CV, think about what you would add value on. That's one. The second one is the most important thing in the boardroom is having good judgment. I've already made this point. Judgment to me means do not be ideological. You're never going to be a value added board member if you come in pounding the table. This is the way the world is. There are ways to do it, and there's a lot of learning that you should invest in to make sure that you're articulating your views, but in a way that's constructive and may not be adopted by the board, by the way. And then the last point is just really thinking about process versus outcome. This is a very delicate balance. I think very often it's very tempting. Oh, this is what we're going to do in terms of outcomes. But we should also think about process without getting into bureaucracies and layers of people. Thinking about how do we balance getting outcomes, getting goals achieved, but at the same time thinking about how do we do that.
That has been such an uplifting and energizing discussion. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience. It's been a real privilege.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to participate.
If you found this conversation interesting and would like to be involved in similar discussions, join the Nurole board community. Community membership gives you access to 24-hour discussion threads on boardroom challenges and opportunities like those we've been discussing, as well as Q&As with senior board members, smart online networking events, one-to-one career sessions with our headhunters, third-party board roles, and a find and mentor service. We're running a limited offer of a 2-month free community trial for Enter the Boardroom listeners. Head to community.nurole.com and apply the code MBC2month.